My name is Gabrielle, and for most of my childhood, I lived with a bright sense of promise. I'd sprawl across my bedroom rug, flipping through college brochures, imagining myself strolling through ivy-covered campuses. Every time I visited my father's workshop, a cramped shed filled with the scents of varnish and sawdust, he'd reassure me he was planning for my education, setting money aside so I wouldn't have to struggle the way he and Mom did. His voice would be confident as he hammered nails into whatever project he had going, saying, "A college fund is like a seed, if we take care of it, it'll blossom." I remember how I'd smile, imagining that seed growing into a full orchard, enough to fuel my dreams of studying marine biology, and maybe traveling the world. I always believed him. In my imagination, Dad was larger than life, a man who worked hard, loved me, and protected that special fund like it was the crown jewel of our modest family. Sometimes, he'd even tease that he'd booby-trapped the account so no one could touch it without my permission. It felt comforting that someone had planned for my future from the start, someone who understood the importance of education more than anything. I had no idea that those reassurances were part of a fragile facade that would soon crumble beneath the weight of his secrets. I started noticing tiny cracks in that facade around my junior year of high school. Dad became more withdrawn. He'd pull out his phone during family dinners, scanning messages with a somber crease in his brow. If I asked him what was wrong, he'd wave me off and say he was just looking into new clients for his carpentry business. I recall this tension in the house when the phone rang at odd hours. Mom would answer in hushed tones, and by morning, there'd be a quiet argument behind the bedroom door. I didn't understand the specifics. My chest felt tight whenever I tried to guess. I'd refocus on my homework, trying to reassure myself that my parents could handle whatever it was. After all, they never let me worry before. But one evening, I overheard Dad on a phone call, voice thick with desperation. He said something about late payments and the risk of losing everything. I remember my skin prickling, as if someone had opened a cold window behind me. I strained my ears, gathering fragments. "I can't make that interest, I'll find a way." My heart gave a heavy thud. But when I confronted him later, he put on his usual stoic expression, patted my shoulder, and muttered, "All is well, sweetheart. Focus on your next exam." I tried. I truly did. I poured my energy into acing science projects, running for student council, volunteering at the local aquarium. Those days, I'd come home exhausted but determined, telling myself it was all part of building the perfect college resume. Sometimes, I'd drift into daydreams about receiving acceptance letters, handing them to Dad, and seeing pride light up his face. It was this vision that kept me pushing through the exhaustion. Even as the undercurrent of tension thickened in our home, I believed it would resolve. That was, until the week I got an email from the State University's financial office, confirming that my partial scholarship had been processed, but the dedicated college fund I'd indicated on my form showed an unexpected insufficient balance status. Confused, I refreshed the web page until my eyes burned. Then I dug deeper, calling a contact at the financial aid department. They explained that while my scholarship money went through fine, the co-labeled 529 account from which my remaining tuition was supposed to come up empty. My stomach did a sickening little flip, like I was on a roller coaster with no harness. None of this made sense. That fund was supposed to have enough to cover at least half my tuition. I still remember pressing the phone to my ear so hard it left a mark on my skin. I kept saying, "Could there be a mistake? This has to be a glitch." The representative sounded apologetic, but the final answer was the same: my college fund was all but depleted. When I asked Dad about it that night, I noticed the way his shoulders tensed, how he avoided eye contact and muttered something under his breath. I pressed him, heart thudding against my ribcage, my fingers curling into my palms so tightly they left little crescent marks. He finally admitted that he'd needed to borrow from it to cover some debts. The word borrow scraped at my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I demanded to know what debts, how much he took, and when he was planning to replace it. I half expected some grand explanation that would make sense of everything, but his response was a maddening shrug. It was just to cover a few overdue bills, he said, his gaze flicking from me to the window. His voice softened, as though he were doing me a kindness. I'll pay it back, don't worry. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Mom just stood in the corner, wringing her hands, eyes darting between us. Dad tried to lay a hand on my shoulder, but I recoiled. I thought of how many times he'd assured me the money was safe, how many nights I'd fallen asleep smiling at the security of it all. My throat felt raw, my words strangled. I remember whispering, "You had no right," and the shock on his face, like he couldn't believe I was accusing him of wrongdoing. In that moment, something inside me twisted beyond repair. My trust in him, the man I idolized, was unraveling like a loose thread. I tried to salvage things with reason. I spent hours on the phone with the bank the next day, pacing a worn patch in our living room carpet, asking if there was any fail-safe that prevented the account holder from withdrawing funds for non-educational purposes. They explained the penalties, tax hits, fees, but the money could still be taken out by the custodian for emergency family use. My father had the legal authority, even if it was ethically dubious. By the time I hung up, my skin felt cold, and my pulse hammered in my temples. Dad's voice echoed from down the hall, telling me not to make a big deal out of it. I trembled from the effort of not screaming at him. Even my mother's gentle attempts to calm me, touches on my arm or offers of tea, felt like friction. I could barely look her in the eye. I wanted to believe she had no knowledge of his actions, but part of me suspected she might have known more than she let on. My head spun with the realization that everything I'd planned since freshman year might be torn out from under me. That night, I tossed restlessly, hugging a pillow to my chest, replaying all Dad's old promises. Each memory stung like an open wound. A week later, I discovered just how deep the financial hole really went. A letter arrived from a collections agency, addressed to Dad. I couldn't help reading the envelope before bringing it to him. There was some official language about default, escalations, possible legal action. The numbers were massive. Then, a second letter referencing other outstanding loans. My breathing quickened. If we were that far behind, it meant Dad had been scrambling for a fix, and my college fund was the easiest pot of money he could grab. He swore up and down he just needed a short-term patch, and that everything would be fine in a few months. But his voice quavered, eyes downcast, hands twisting a frayed edge of his shirt. It struck me then, maybe he didn't just breach my trust, maybe he was drowning so profoundly that he'd convinced himself it was okay to sink me too. The thought made me feel sick to my core. He wanted me to give him time, but I felt time slipping away. Orientation was around the corner, tuition due dates were looming, and I couldn't afford a fiasco. Anger pulsed in my veins, but so did a desperate need to figure out a solution. My frustration turned into an almost manic energy. I combed through scholarship lists, applied for small grants, rummaged the internet for possible sponsors or special programs. Anything that would help me fill the gap left by my father's betrayal. Meanwhile, my father's response was to ask me to just trust that he'd handle it, as if trust were some infinite commodity he could tap. My responses got shorter, colder. I'd practically grind my teeth whenever he spoke. My mother, though sympathetic, refused to stand firmly by me or him. She'd clasp her hands in front of her apron and whisper that Dad was going through a tough time, that he needed understanding. That maybe I should wait until his finances rebounded. My patience had dissolved. My fear of losing my chance at higher education overshadowed everything else. One evening, I finally snapped at dinner. He tried to spin a story of an opportunity that would help him pay back the debt. The evasiveness, the vague promise, it all felt like a stale rerun. My hands shook so hard I set my fork down to hide the trembling. My jaw clenched so painfully I thought my teeth might crack. Without letting him finish, I stood and walked out into the night air. My mother called after me, but I kept going. That was the first time I realized I might need to protect myself legally, even if it meant going against my own father. The very idea sat like a stone in my gut. A father is supposed to shelter you from storms, not cause them. I swallowed my pride and scheduled an appointment with a lawyer who offered a free initial consultation. Sitting in that cramped waiting room, the overhead lights buzzing, I tried to keep my mind from replaying every warm childhood memory I had of Dad. The conflict tore at me. When my turn came, I explained the situation in a halting voice, cheeks burning with embarrassment. The lawyer, stern and methodical, asked pointed questions about the account structure, whether my name was on it, how the withdrawals happened. I handed over the statements I managed to print out. She skimmed them with a slight frown, then explained that while I might have grounds to file a complaint, it could be tricky because, legally speaking, custodians often have broad powers. There could be penalties if he misused the funds, but it might not guarantee I'd get them back in time for my tuition due date. My insides twisted. She also mentioned the possibility of investigating whether any part of the money was specifically earmarked through a will or trust. If not, it would be an uphill battle. As I left, my heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. I decided I wouldn't go quietly into that good night. If Dad wouldn't fix it, I'd find a way to hold him accountable, no matter how uncomfortable it made me. Days bled into weeks. I emailed scholarship committees daily, phoned around for part-time gigs on campus, and tried to channel my fury into productivity. Dad's phone calls to the house became more clipped, often reeking of tension. Sometimes, I'd eavesdrop on him pacing the kitchen, telling unknown voices on the other end that he was this close to a new arrangement. I almost felt sorry for him, seeing the slope of his shoulders, the tired slump in his posture, like a man running from his shadow. But every time sympathy welled, I'd remember the empty account. I'd remember how he chose his own desperation over my future. That realization made my voice go taut whenever we spoke. He'd ask me to hang on just a little while longer, but the thought of deferring my admission or letting my scholarship slip away sent panic flutters across my ribcage. I told him I had no intention of waiting. He'd grit his teeth, frustration etched on his face. My mother tried to broker peace, but it was too late to smooth over a chasm this deep. I ended up receiving a partial extension from the university, explaining in uncertain terms that there was a family financial complication, and I needed a bit more time to get my funds in order. They gave me a reprieve of a few weeks, which felt like a small mercy. In that window, I reached out to old family friends, scoured for any leads. One day, a friend of my late grandmother passed me a worn envelope, saying it was something my grandmother had set aside years ago for my education. Inside, I found receipts and notes indicating she'd contributed a chunk of money specifically for my college. It wasn't huge, but it was something. My eyes brimmed as I ran a finger over her delicate handwriting. This sum might have disappeared along with the rest, but if I could prove it was strictly meant for my benefit, maybe my father's decisions could be challenged more forcefully. That envelope felt like an anchor of hope. I hurried to the same lawyer, laid those notes on her desk, and asked if it changed anything. She studied them, letting out a thoughtful hum. These documents, while not constituting a formal trust, indicated a clear intention from my grandmother. The lawyer said it could strengthen my stance. If we could show that Dad misappropriated funds specifically willed or intended for my name, it might give us grounds for a stronger legal claim. My chest fluttered with cautious optimism, though I felt a tremor run through my hands. This was all so foreign to me, turning to the legal system to confront my own father. I went home with that evidence pressed to my chest. Before I could strategize further, I stepped inside to find my father rummaging through documents on the kitchen counter, his phone on speaker emitting tinny voices. He stopped short when he saw me. I moved to tuck my envelope into my bag, but his gaze fixed on it, and I realized he knew exactly what it was. In a low voice, he demanded I hand over whatever I had. My stomach twisted. I shook my head, stepping back. He lunged, not violently, but with a desperation that made my heart pound. Mom rushed in, trying to defuse the moment, but I clutched my bag. I remember the distinct sense that everything was unraveling, the illusions of paternal love overshadowed by his frantic grab at a last lifeline. I managed to twist away and lock myself in my room. Outside, his voice rose, every bit of frustration and fear swirling in his words. I stayed behind that locked door, tears sliding down my cheeks, physically trembling as I realized I was no longer safe to treat him as a father figure who just needed time. He'd burn any bridge if it meant saving himself. The next morning, he was gone. Mom said he left early, maybe to meet with some potential lender. I took the chance to pack a few basics. I texted a close friend who agreed I could crash at her place if things escalated. Just as I finished stuffing my duffel, my phone buzzed. The lawyer's voice crackled through, telling me we had an option. We could file a motion to freeze any of Dad's remaining assets that might have come from my grandmother's intended contributions, preventing him from depleting everything further. It wouldn't be simple. We had to show that irreparable harm would occur if he was allowed to keep diverting funds. My shoulders were rigid, mind spinning with the enormity of it. But I knew if I hesitated, Dad might funnel whatever was left into settling his debts, and I'd never see a cent. Later that day, I started the paperwork, tears periodically blurring my vision as I scrawled my signature. The lawyer advised me to keep the original notes from Grandma's envelope safe, maybe in a bank deposit box, or with someone I trusted. My father had proven he'd do almost anything. I slid those precious papers into a protective sleeve, heart pounding with every step. Mom trailed me, face lined with worry, but offered no protest. I think she realized that if Dad was beyond reason, I had no choice but to protect myself. The unexpected turn came when I discovered a thick manila folder hidden in the back of Dad's workshop. I'd gone in there searching for a small safe he sometimes used for valuable tools, thinking maybe my grandmother's receipts might be there too. Instead, I found a stash of letters and financial statements that implied Dad had been moving money between accounts for over a year. Some pages bore sketches of a timeline, as if he'd calculated exactly when he'd pull out the funds. It wasn't just desperation, he'd been planning it. My whole body went cold as I realized he hadn't simply fallen behind and decided on a quick fix. This was methodical. There were notes referencing a debt collector named Ross, scribbled sums, even a horrifying line that read, GS college equals potential fallback. My knees nearly gave out. G was me, Gabrielle. My father had apparently viewed my college savings as a fallback plan for his financial mistakes for months. My throat burned. I steadied myself against his dusty workbench, inhaling the sawdust-laden air, wishing it would drown out the sickening sense of betrayal. I snatched the folder and backed out of the workshop, hardly believing my own father could have orchestrated something so cold. That was my pivot point, where heartbreak fused into a steely resolution. I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a father who'd messed up. I was dealing with someone who'd systematically undermined my future to rescue himself. Any lingering illusions shattered. I brought these documents straight to my lawyer. The sense of gravity in her posture was unmistakable. She knew this changed the game. She said we had proof that his actions were deliberate, and not merely a last-minute emergency withdrawal. It could bolster our plea to the court for an emergency injunction. I filed everything, ignoring the pang in my chest that this was my father I was fighting. The adrenaline from betrayal kept me moving, a silent roaring in my ears. The next few weeks blended into a blur of court forms, hurried phone calls, and tears of frustration. I'd leave my lawyer's office with new instructions, gather more statements, cross-check bank logs, find anything that referenced the original terms of the account. Meanwhile, Dad ramped up the intimidation tactics. One morning, I woke to find him standing in the driveway, arms crossed, glaring at me as I stepped out of my friend's house. He didn't say a word, just drilled his stare into me. I froze, my palms suddenly damp. When he finally spoke, he hissed that I was about to bring ruin upon our entire family, that if I truly loved him, I'd drop this. My cheeks flared with heat. I stammered that if he'd loved me, he wouldn't have plotted to spend the money I'd worked so hard to earn scholarships to complement. Then I stepped past him, heart pounding, refusing to let him see the tears welling. I felt him fuming behind me, but I didn't look back. Eventually, the court date for the injunction arrived. Mom tried to mediate, calling me in the days before, begging me to meet Dad in person, work something out privately. But I couldn't trust him. I told her I'd see him in court. My entire body quivered with nerves as I entered that austere room. The fluorescent lights amplified every anxious breath. Dad was already there with an attorney who refused to meet my eyes. My father looked thinner, but his expression was defiant. Our lawyers presented arguments. We showed the bank statements, the manila folder with Dad's notes. Dad's lawyer argued that everything was done out of necessity, and that my father intended to repay once he stabilized. I wanted to shout that he'd told me that same lie for months, all while systematically planning to drain the account. My lawyer calmly pointed to the references to GS college equals potential fallback. She emphasized that Dad had siphoned these funds away before I'd even started applying for universities. The judge's face stayed neutral, but I noticed a flicker in his eyes when my lawyer read aloud some of Dad's notes. At the end, the judge declared there was enough evidence to grant a temporary freeze on any relevant assets connected to the original funds. Dad's jaw clenched so hard I could see a muscle ticking near his temple. I exhaled shakily. This at least meant he couldn't keep funneling money without oversight. But it was only the beginning. We still had to push for restitution, to make him replenish whatever he could. The days that followed tested my resolve. Dad's phone calls to me turned furious. When I ignored them, he sent long texts accusing me of betraying the family, of being ungrateful for all the times he'd provided for me. My shoulders tensed, and my stomach lurched whenever my phone buzzed. But I forced myself to read every message, storing them in a file I labeled evidence, because some of them essentially admitted his wrongdoing. I felt numb each time I saved a screenshot, like I was cataloging the remains of what had once been a loving father-daughter bond. Meanwhile, I scrambled to secure an emergency loan for the first semester, praying that by next semester, some partial restitution might be recovered. I took on a part-time job at a cafe near campus, juggling training sessions with calls to my lawyer. Exhaustion clung to me day and night, but I refused to give up. I kept reminding myself that if I let him get away with this, I'd probably drown in student debt or lose out on my chance entirely. My father's lawyer tried to set up a meeting to discuss an out-of-court settlement, but the terms were laughable. He'd return a fraction over several years, and only if I agreed not to pursue further legal action. It was a manipulative tactic aimed at making me give up. I wanted to scream at the injustice. I continued living out of my friend's spare room, a cozy but cramped space that smelled of lavender and old books. At least I felt safe there, far from the suffocating tension of my parents' home. Mom would send tearful voicemails, saying she missed me. I missed her too, but I couldn't stand the idea of stepping back into that house. Maybe someday we'd mend things, but not yet. My entire life became a balancing act. Adjusting to college assignments during the day, dealing with legal updates at lunch, then heading to my cafe shift until late. My backpack seemed perpetually stuffed with textbooks, court documents, and stress. Sometimes, while frothing milk for lattes, I'd catch myself trembling, wishing none of this was real. But the sting of betrayal drove me forward. Halfway through the semester, an unexpected development shook everything again. My father's lawyer sent us a barrage of new documents, presumably to bury us in paperwork. But buried within was a slip referencing an old trust left by my grandfather, one none of us had known about. Grandfather had set aside a small property fund that Dad had apparently sold off quietly, funneling part of that money to pay down his debts and possibly replenish some of my college fund. Except he never did. The whiplash of this revelation sent me reeling. Not only had Dad siphoned my account, he'd also sold a chunk of the family's inheritance that might have helped him repay me. Instead, that money vanished into the same black hole of personal loans. I felt my nails dig into my palms as I stared at that line in the documents. My father had so many resources to fix his mistakes, and he'd chosen to squander them, all while telling me to trust him. Another wave of anger frothed in my chest, merging with heartbreak. My lawyer saw potential in this new revelation. If Dad had misrepresented how he was using the trust from my grandfather, that might be legal grounds for further claims. We built an amendment to our case, demonstrating how methodical his deception was. Part of me ached at the thought of turning the knife deeper, but each step I took felt like self-preservation now. If I didn't stand my ground, I'd be the one left with nothing. Finally, the culminating hearing arrived. My father and I sat on opposite sides of a polished wooden table in a hushed courtroom, each with our attorneys, a scattering of curious onlookers, and a clerk tapping notes. The judge requested we present a full timeline. My lawyer meticulously laid out every transaction, from the initial $529 plan deposit through the grandmother's envelope, and concluding with the property trust fiasco. Dad's lawyer tried to paint him as a well-intentioned man crushed by debt. Dad cast sorrowful glances toward me, as though he'd done everything for the family's survival. But each time our eyes locked, I felt that familiar jolt of betrayal. I forced myself to remain calm, focusing on the trembling in my thighs, the dryness in my mouth, the tightness in my chest, anything to stay grounded instead of losing composure. I spoke clearly about the devastation I felt upon discovering the fund was empty, about the suspicious documents I found in his workshop, about how I'd had to scramble to secure last-minute loans just to start classes. My voice wavered, but I refused to yield. Dad's lawyer tried to depict me as an impatient daughter who didn't understand adult pressures, but the evidence of his premeditated plan spoke louder. By the end of that session, the judge's expression had hardened. He declared that Dad had indeed breached his obligations to me, misusing funds that were clearly intended for my education. While the court couldn't magically restore all the lost money, it required him to set up a restitution schedule into a protected account monitored by a financial trustee. If he failed to comply, further legal consequences loomed. My breath caught in my throat when the judge pronounced that decision. It wasn't the triumphant windfall I once naively hoped for, but it was something tangible. The corners of my eyes stung, and a shaky exhale left my lips. Dad stood there, shoulders rigid, a faint tremor in his jaw. He tried to meet my gaze. For a split second, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes, or maybe just frustration that he couldn't wriggle free. My lawyer squeezed my elbow lightly. I realized I'd been holding my breath. As we stepped out, reporters from a small local station approached. Apparently a family legal drama had caught a bit of attention. I just lowered my head and walked on. This was personal, not some spectacle. Dad's first payment was due within a month. The attorney handling the trustee account assured me he'd track every deposit. I also learned that the judge imposed a small penalty, effectively punishing him for the willful misuse of a dedicated education fund. Over the next weeks, Dad made partial deposits, complaining through text messages that this was putting him on the brink of bankruptcy. My chest felt heavier each time I read them. I took no glee in seeing him suffer financially, it just deepened the sadness of the entire ordeal. But I hardened myself with the reminder that if he had been honest from the start, we might have found a better path. The damage, though, was already done. I continued my cafe job, balancing classes and the slow drip of restitution that might help cover future semesters. I missed the father I thought I knew, the one who used to build me little wooden puzzles and promise me the stars. Sometimes, in the hush of night, I'd recall how he'd tuck me into bed with stories of adventure, telling me I was destined for greatness. I wondered if he believed those words himself. One morning, he showed up outside the cafe where I worked, waiting for me to finish my shift. My heart thudded the moment I saw him through the window. Part of me wanted to hide in the back and let him wait forever. But I stepped out, apron clutched in my hands, hoping for some civil conversation. He looked worn, maybe older than I'd ever seen him. He thanked me for coming outside, then mumbled a strained apology. His voice shook as he admitted he'd lost control, that the debts had built up until he panicked. I wanted to believe him, but I felt no relief. The memory of the workshop documents still haunted me. He'd planned this for months. I managed a quiet reply. I didn't want it to be like this, and his eyes glistened for a moment. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but no words came. After a tense beat of silence, I turned and left. My shoulders felt like lead, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't look back. By the time I finished my freshman year, the restitution payments, though erratic, had accumulated enough for me to pay down some of my loan. It wasn't the comfortable buffer I'd once counted on, but it was a critical lifeline. Occasionally, I'd feel a spark of guilt for taking money from a man clearly struggling. But each time, I reminded myself that it was my money to begin with. He hadn't hesitated to drain it. Now, the law mandated him to fix some portion of what he broke. I clung to that thought during the nights I'd study until my vision blurred, knowing I couldn't afford to fail even one course. The friend whose couch I slept on earlier eventually became my roommate in a modest off-campus apartment. Mom visited me once, bringing homemade soup and a swirl of apologies, but we didn't discuss Dad. I think we both knew the topic was too raw. What I came to accept was that justice rarely feels clean or joyful. Even winning a court battle left me with an odd emptiness, a sense that the innocence of our family had been irreparably crushed. The next 2 years saw me continuing to juggle part-time work and classes, Dad forced to adhere to the legal schedule. Sometimes he missed a payment or two, claiming more financial strain, but the trustee promptly reminded him that the court's patience had limits. Eventually, he complied, though the amounts were far less than what I would have had if he'd never touched the fund. Through it all, I tried to remain focused on my studies and not let bitterness corrode every part of me. There were nights I'd dream about him pushing me on a swing when I was little, or the two of us laughing on the shoreline, collecting seashells. I'd wake up feeling hollow, remembering the father I once had, the father who promised me the world. Some losses can't be quantified, no matter how many restitution checks get written. I'm heading into my final year now. Despite the hurdles, I'm on track to graduate with a major in marine biology, though the journey has left scars. My father and I speak rarely. I sometimes catch glimpses of his social media, pictures that show him still working odd carpentry jobs, looking older, perhaps weighed by regret. My mother assures me he's proud of me in private, but he's never told me so himself. I've slowly started to forgive him in my own way, not with a grand gesture, but by letting go of the anger that once kept me up at night. That doesn't mean we are close, or that I trust him again, it just means I've chosen to free myself from hatred. I don't know if he'll ever fully understand the damage he inflicted, or how deeply I had to dig to fight back. But I do know he regrets it. I see it in his tired eyes, in the faltering messages he occasionally sends me. I'll never forget the day I discovered my college fund was gone, the day that shattered my illusions of safety. Yet I also learned the power of resilience. Even when someone you love betrays you, you can rise and fight for what's rightfully yours. I made him face legal consequences, forced him to acknowledge that his desperation didn't grant him a license to steal my future. It was messy, heartbreaking, and it's left rifts that might never fully heal. But I'm still standing, still chasing my dreams, forging a path forward that belongs to me alone. And in quiet moments, I tell myself that surviving this ordeal proves I can survive almost anything.